Hi, my name's Andrew and this is McMahon's RCT Station. In this video we'll go through 12 tips to improve the look of your parks in RollerCoaster Tycoon. Going for better looking parks in RCT is certainly not essential and can be pretty expensive, making it less appropriate for some of the game's more challenging scenarios. But for me at least, it adds to the enjoyment and satisfaction of playing the game. These tips, which are in no particular order, are intended to be easy to implement and don't include things like scenery buildings or OpenRCT2 tile inspector trickery. There's already some great videos out there on buildings, and I'll leave a few links in the description with some of my favourites. Please keep in mind that what constitutes a good looking park in RCT is highly subjective. These tips I've put together consist purely of my own opinions on characteristics of what I think make a good looking park. With all that out of the way, let's get into it. Number 1. Don't make your park completely flat. Even just some gentle elevation changes can really help give your park another dimension and a more natural feel. When starting a sandbox park, it's a good idea to incorporate at least a few subtle elevation differences. It can certainly help your park look a little less bland once it's finished. If you're using OpenRCT2, you can also take advantage of the amazing map generation tool to do a lot of the hard work for you. In parks with existing landscape variations, try and do your best to work in thoughtful flat ride placement and practice your terrain hugging coasters, as opposed to just flattening large areas of land to make it easier to build. Random small bodies of water like this can also work well. On existing bodies of water, something I really like is adding in jagged rocks around shorelines to spruce things up a bit. Note that landscaping can be expensive and time consuming. The mountain tool can be a real time saver here. Number 2. Mix up your surface textures. One of the more underutilized things I tend to see is a mix of terrain surfaces. This can be a simple but effective way of naturalizing areas. The good thing is you really don't have to put a whole lot of thought into it. You can make it quite random, which can also contribute to the more natural look. Using textures such as the grassy dirt in between highly contrasting surfaces like dirt, rock, and grass can help create smooth transitions. Here we see a decent looking coaster with little terrain work, and here it is again mixing up surface textures underneath. Also, don't neglect the terrain surfaces underwater. They can really help create the illusion of varying depth. Number 3. Put in a variety of trees and shrubs. Trees and shrubs are probably the most obvious and effective thing you can add to improve the look of your park. There's a huge range to pick from, and it's best to use a mix for a more natural look. Parks with one type of tree can look a little one-dimensional and artificial. Make sure you spend time playing around with different combinations. You might be surprised with how well some trees combine together. A variety of shrubs are also great at naturalizing the landscape and giving the park a more complete feel. They can also provide a nice alternative to spamming garden beds everywhere. Don't stress about filling every single tile with a tree or shrub. Leaving a few tiles can actually be a good thing, unless you're going for a more dense jungle or rainforest theme. Here's that same coaster again with some trees and shrubs along with a mix of terrain surfaces from the previous tip. There's also a few gameplay benefits from investing in scenery like this. They add to the excitement rating of rides, particularly roller coasters. This increases your park value and the price you can charge for them, making the ride itself potentially more profitable. Number 4. Fences. Using appropriate fences really help improve the look and add to the realism of your parks. They can also help give the park a somewhat tidy and organized look. You don't necessarily have to ensure all of your paths have adjacent fencing, but it can really help around the perimeter of rides and definitely around the area of roller coasters. It's also not a bad idea to have a variety and mix up fencing in the park. Also, make sure you pick appropriate fencing if you're going for a certain theme. Here's that running example of ours with a fence around it, making it look a little more smart. Number 5. Don't spam the water. Something which never looks that sensible or realistic to me is having a bunch of rides and pathway on the water. Sure, if you're going for an amusement park on a pier, it makes sense, but putting something like a hedge maze on water just looks, well, frankly a bit silly. Of course, lots of coasters in real life have elements that look really cool over the water, but I don't know of many coasters in real life that sit entirely above water like this. Number 6. Reduce elevated pathways and rides. Something that really grinds my gears is seeing pathways and attractions ridiculously high off the ground. The supports just look like a real eyesore to me and a bit unrealistic. There are occasions where elevated paths look great, such as for bridges, but it's something I'd suggest avoiding where you can. You can either remove the need for ride and path supports using terrain work, or cover them up with scenery buildings. Number 7. Decorate your paths appropriately. Of course, most of you are probably aware that litter bins and benches are pretty much essential to the operation of a good park, but don't underestimate how much they contribute to the aesthetics. While there's nothing wrong with filling out every path tile with a bench or bin, it can look a bit crowded. Try spreading them out a little instead, with the exception being food courts where having a cluster of benches and bins makes more sense. Lampposts on the other hand aren't essential, but can look really cool when used in a non-spammy way. Use of wider paths also helps with pathing additions looking too crowded, as only one bench, lamp or bin is placed instead of two. Number 8. Pay attention to your track supports. Something that you shouldn't neglect is the realism of your track supports. There's some RCT players nowadays that have turned support work into a real art form, but this can definitely chew away at your time. If it's not practical for you to spend time on complex support structures, at the very least check that the default supports drawn look believable and tidy. It doesn't really affect the ratings or safety of your rides, but having a large under-supported section of track like this because of pathing underneath looks a bit odd. Another thing to avoid is placing trees directly under track like this, as it doesn't make too much sense. On a similar note, coaster track sitting on the ground looks a little bit unrealistic, as coaster track very rarely, if ever, sits purely on the ground in real life. I suggest lowering the land at least one height unit so that the supports are drawn. Number 9. Give your rides room to breathe. Spacing rides out a bit can make a big difference to the look of your park. Of course, there's always going to be a place for ride interaction, but in general, giving your rides space can help them stand out in their own right. Whether it's a coaster, thrill ride, or carousel, I always like to give each ride its own space and purpose. This can mean doing something as simple as putting it on a small mound, or having a small boundary around the perimeter of the ride with some light scenery in between. This can also help blend rides into their surroundings. Here's an example of a pretty crowded section of park. If we spread the rides out from each other, we can do some decorating in between to make everything blend together. On a similar note, avoid clustering your shops and stores like this. The shop store buildings in RCT for the most part are pretty extreme, so I think they're better off being alone, or at the very least a tile or two apart with some scenery in between. You can of course use scenery buildings to cover them up too. Spacing out food drink options is also better for your guests. Number 10. Have a park entrance. Most parks in real life have some sort of centerpiece or entrance area that sets the tone or theme, and can help your park have a focal point that you can build and expand from. It doesn't have to be a grand scenery building necessarily. Things like a small pond with some basic gardens and shrubbery, or a small plaza with some statues or fountains can do the trick. Number 11. Add some curves and flow to your parks. Probably the hardest one to describe. With the 2D isometric versions of the game being discussed here, which are RCT 1, 2, and Classic, it's easy to end up with park layouts that look boxy or rectangular. Large straight sections of track rides and path also don't help. An easy thing you can do to combat this is implementing more elliptical or circular pathing networks. If this isn't practical, at least try and keep pathing networks organized from the get-go, as opposed to tacking on extra pathing loops as you go, which can quickly get chaotic. Not only is this beneficial for aesthetics, but tends to help guest pathfinding too. Use of diagonal track on coasters and S-bends on water rides like log flumes can also introduce some nice angles into your park. Back to our running example from earlier, replacing the last third of this coaster with some diagonal track and the surrounding pathing can help make the area flow a little better. There is a neat trick you can use which actually takes advantage of the 2D isometric perspective. If you dig down on one corner of a land tile, you can place fences on the sloped land to give a diagonal fence illusion, which can also break up the perpendicularity nicely. Just make sure to rotate and block the zigzagging fence with trees or scenery to cover the other angles. And on that note, we finish with number 12. Check your work from each perspective. This further stems from the limitations of the 2D isometric views discussed earlier. You'll be surprised at how good a section of your park can look from one angle, only to find that it's got some glaring holes from another. It's going to be hard to make it look perfect from all angles, but at the very least you can make a few adjustments to fill in any glaring, gaping holes from other perspectives. And there were my 12 tips to improve the look of your parks in RollerCoaster Tycoon. Hopefully you found these useful and can apply them yourself at some stage. If you have any tips or suggestions yourself, feel free to share them in the comments below. Thank you all for watching, and I'll see you next time. Cheers!